In the high kingdom of Thessaly, where the kings traced their line 1,000 years and prized the old tongue above gold, there was a thing the scholars said that the proud forgot. A language survives in the mouths it thinks beneath its notice. It meant that the old high tongue of Thessaly, the language of the first kings, of the founding oaths and the oldest poems, spoken now only by a handful of lettered nobles who learned it as a mark of breeding, had not, in fact, died out among the common folk. It had lived on, quietly, in the low places the proud never listened to, in the lullabies of poor mothers, the market songs of fishwives, the prayers of grandmothers, carried in the mouths of people the court considered too lowly to possess anything so precious. The proud believed the old tongue was theirs alone, a treasure of breeding. They were wrong. It had simply gone where they never looked. Iona was one of the mouths they never looked at, a wolfless, full-figured baker's daughter from the harbor quarter. She had been raised by a grandmother who sang the old songs and prayed the old prayers and spoke, in the warm kitchen of childhood, the old high tongue of Thessaly as easily as breathing, because it had come down to her, mouth to mouth, through poor women the court had never once thought worth listening to. Iona spoke it fluently. She had never thought it remarkable. It was simply the language her grandmother loved her in. She did not know that she would be sent up to the palace, chosen for her baking, to serve at the king's own table. Or that the king, proud, cold, certain the old tongue was the private property of his breeding, would look at the chubby harbor girl and insult her in it, openly, certain no common ear could understand. Or that she would answer him back, fluently, in the same forgotten tongue, and that the alpha king of Thessaly would freeze, in front of his whole court, as the ground of everything he believed shifted beneath him. Chapter 1. She was sent up for her bread, which was the only thing about Iona the great folk had ever found worth noticing. It was a true gift she baked the way her grandmother had taught her. The old harbor recipes, breads that were warm and honest and unforgettable, and her small shop in the harbor quarter drew buyers from beyond the wharf the way nothing else in that poor street did. And so when the palace sought a baker for the king's own table, the old one having died, and the king being particular about his bread in the way proud men are particular about small things the search had, eventually, by way of a steward who'd tasted her loaves at a harbor festival, reached the full-figured wolfless baker's daughter on Net Mender's Lane. She took it without much joy. She knew how the great folk looked at a woman built as she was built, knew the glances, the assumptions, the way the high-born read a full figure as a failing, a lack of discipline, a thing to be remarked upon behind a hand. She had borne it her whole life, the harbor quarter's own teasing, the fine customers' raised eyebrows, the thousand small cruelties a kingdom that prized lean grace reserved for a woman who took up honest space. She had made her peace with it, mostly in the way her grandmother had taught her: you are not less for being more of yourself, child. Let the thin ones be thin and the small ones be small, and you be warm and full and exactly as God and good bread made you. She had stopped, long ago, shrinking herself to fit other people's notions of what a woman should be. But she had not stopped feeling the glances, and when she came up to the palace, into the cold, proud halls of Thessaly, the glances were the worst she had ever felt. The high court's lean, elegant disdain for the chubby harbor girl who'd been let in to make their bread. The eyes that traveled over her full figure and dismissed her in a single contemptuous sweep before they'd heard her speak a word. She set her jaw and kept her grandmother's voice in her ear and went to do her work. She did not expect to meet the king at all. Bakers did not meet kings. She met him on the third day, and it went worse than any glance. Chapter 2. The king came down to the kitchens himself, an unusual thing, but he was particular about his bread, and wished, the steward fretted, to inspect the new baker whose loaves had pleased him. King Theron, of Thessaly the High Wolf, a proud cold man in his prime, who wore his 1,000-year line like armor and prized the old breeding above all things, came into the warm kitchen with 2 lettered nobles at his side, and his gaze fell on Iona, and traveled over her full figure with the practiced contempt of a man for whom a body was a measure of worth, and dismissed her before she'd straightened from her bow. The bread was excellent, even the king's cold face conceded that, tasting it. But the baker amused him. In the cruel way the proud are amused by what they consider beneath them, and he turned to his lettered nobles, and he said, in the old high tongue of Thessaly, with a thin smile, certain that no common harbor girl could possibly understand, "A pity such bread comes from such a vessel. She has eaten more of her own craft than she has sold, by the look of her. Set a glutton to baking, and you feed her vice. Observe how the dough has gone to the baker. One marvels she leaves any loaves for the table." His lettered nobles laughed, the soft-cultured laugh of men sharing a cruelty in a tongue they believe is theirs alone. The kitchen servants, who spoke no old high tongue, looked on in puzzlement, sensing the cruelty in the laughter without understanding the words. And the king turned back to his bread, satisfied, certain his insult had passed clean over the chubby harbor girl's uncomprehending head, a private amusement in the private language of his breeding, spoken safely in front of a common ear too lowly to possess it. But Iona had understood every word. She had understood it the way she understood her grandmother's lullabies, easily, fluently, in her bones. Because the old high tongue the king thought was the private treasure of his 1,000-year line was the very tongue her grandmother had loved her in the warm kitchen of a poor harbor childhood. Carried down through generations of poor women the court had never once thought worth listening to. The king had insulted her, cruelly, in the one language he was certain she could not understand. And he was about to learn exactly how wrong a proud man can be about who possesses what. Chapter 3. Iona straightened from her work, and she answered him in the old high tongue of Thessaly, fluent and clear and perfect, the founding language of his 1,000-year line rolling off the tongue of the chubby harbor baker as easily as it had ever rolled off any lettered nobles. You mistake the loaf for the larder, my lord. A baker is built by her bread the way a king is built by his crown, and I have never yet seen a king blamed for the weight of his gold. I am full because I am fed, and I am fed because my craft is good. And a woman who feeds others and herself besides has committed no vice but generosity. You have eaten of that generosity this very morning and called it excellent with your own mouth. It is a strange lord who praises the loaf and insults the oven, and stranger still who does it in a tongue he thinks too high for the woman who answers him in it. The kitchen went utterly silent. The king of Thessaly turned, slowly, from his bread, and stared at the chubby harbor girl who had just answered his private cruelty in the old high tongue, the founding language of his line, the treasure he believed was the sole possession of his breeding, fluently, perfectly, and with a wit that had turned his own insult inside out and handed it back to him gutted. And the high wolf of Thessaly froze. His lettered nobles had gone white. The king's cold, proud face had drained of its certainty, drained of everything, struck blank with a shock that went all the way down, because he had insulted a common baker in the secret language of kings, certain it could not be understood, and the common baker had answered him in it more fluently and more cuttingly than his own lettered nobles could have managed. And every single thing he believed about who possessed the old tongue, about what his breeding meant, about what separated his 1,000-year line from the harbor quarter, had just cracked beneath his feet in front of his whole kitchen. You, the king, began, in the common tongue, and could not finish. He had no end to the sentence. There was no end to it that did not require him to understand a thing he could not yet understand. Speak the old tongue, my lord, if you like, Iona said in the old tongue, evenly, returning to her dough. I find I follow it well enough. My grandmother loved me in it. She had it from her grandmother, who had it from hers, all the way down through women you would call too low to hold it. We have been keeping your treasure for you, my lord, in the harbor quarter, in our lullabies and our kitchens, for as long as your lettered nobles have been keeping it in their books. The difference is, we never thought it too good to say to a fat baker's child. We only thought it beautiful. So we kept it warm. She met his frozen gaze. You may have it back any time you like. We were never keeping it from you. We were only keeping it alive. Chapter 4. He could not let it go. A proud man, struck where his pride lived, must understand the thing that struck him, and so the king, instead of dismissing the impudent baker, which his fury half demanded, found himself, against every instinct of his breeding, coming back to the kitchens. He came the next day, and the next, ostensibly about his bread, in truth about the impossible thing, a harbor baker, who spoke the founding tongue of his line more fluently than his court. And he questioned her sharp, disbelieving questions, the questions of a man whose certainties have cracked and who is probing the crack to learn how deep it goes. Where had she learned it? From whom? How perfectly? Could she read it, or only speak it? Could she and hear his voice changed? Could she speak the old poems, the founding verses, the oldest oaths, that even his lettered nobles stumbled over? She could. Her grandmother had sung them as lullabies. Iona recited them, by heart, in the warm kitchen. The founding poems of Thessaly that the court treated as sacred lettered treasures, recited them in the cadence of a harbor lullaby, perfectly, with an ease and a warmth that the king's stiff-lettered scholars had never brought to them in their lives. Because to the scholars they were a treasure to be guarded, and to Iona's grandmother they had been a way to lull a child to sleep. And the king of Thessaly, who had believed the old tongue was the private property of his breeding, the thing that proved his 1,000-year line was a thing apart and above, sat in a harbor baker's kitchen and listened to her speak his founding language more beautifully than his whole court. and felt the armor of his pride coming apart plate by plate. "It cannot be," he said, low, on the third day. "The old tongue is the mark of the line. Of the breeding. It is what separates us, the kings, the lettered, the high from the common. It is the proof that we are a thing apart. And you are telling me it has been living in the harbor quarter all this while, in lullabies, in the mouths of he could not say fat bakers' daughters, not now in the mouths of common women, kept alive in kitchens, while my court kept it in books and thought we held it alone." "Yes, my lord," Iona said simply, kneading her dough. "That's exactly what I'm telling you. The thing you thought separated you from us was never yours alone. It was just yours, and ours, and you never knew the ours, because you never once listened to a harbor grandmother sing. You thought your breeding kept the treasure. But breeding doesn't keep a language alive, my lord love does. The lettered nobles kept it in books, where it sat. The poor women kept it in lullabies, where it lived, and you insulted a fat baker in it. Certain she couldn't hold a thing so high, and the truth is the harbor quarter has been holding it warm for 1,000 years, while your court held it cold." Chapter 5. He kept her, and not, now, as a baker. The king, having discovered that a harbor girl spoke the founding tongue of his line more truly than his court, did a thing that scandalized the whole palace. He had Iona brought up out of the kitchens to the scholars' halls, set among the lettered nobles whose breeding was supposed to make them the keepers of the old tongue, because she knew it better than any of them, and the king whose certainties had cracked wanted to understand the thing she carried, and the court was vicious about it. A chubby, wolfless baker's daughter, set among the lettered nobles, treated as a keeper of the sacred tongue, it offended every prejudice the proud court held. About breeding, about worth, about bodies, about who was permitted to possess what was beautiful, the lettered nobles, humiliated to find a harbor girl out speaking them in their own treasure, were the cruelest, and the cruelty came, again and again, back to her body, the fat baker, the glutton, the common vessel, as though her figure were the disproof of everything her fluent tongue demonstrated. But Iona did not shrink, and she did not apologize for the space she took, and she met every cruelty with her grandmother's steadiness. "You are not less for being more of yourself," and she went on speaking the old tongue more beautifully than any of them. Because the truth of what she carried did not depend in the slightest on the shape of the body that carried it, and the king came to her, in the evenings, in the scholars' halls, because the thing she'd shown him had cracked his pride wide open, and he could not stop returning to the crack. She learned him sideways, that he was a man who had been raised to believe his breeding was the whole of his worth, that the 1,000-year line, the old tongue, the lean, elegant grace of the high-born, all of it proved that the kings of Thessaly were a thing apart and above the common, and that this belief had been the armor he wore and the lonely, cold prison he lived in, that he had never once questioned it until a fat harbor baker answered his cruelty in the founding tongue, and proved the treasure he thought made him separate had been living all along in the mouths he despised. That he was, beneath the proud, cold armor, beginning to understand a thing that frightened and freed him at once, that everything he'd been taught made him superior, had only ever made him blind. "You insulted my body, my lord, that first day," Iona said one evening, not unkindly, in the old tongue. "Called me a glutton, a vessel ruined by its own craft, and I've thought about why, since why a man would look at a baker and see, first, a body to be scorned." She looked at him. "It's the same blindness, isn't it? The thing that made you scorn my figure is the same thing that made you certain I couldn't hold your tongue. You've been taught your whole life that worth lives in the outside of a person, in the lean grace, the fine breeding, the elegant form, that a body that takes up honest space is a lesser body, and a common mouth is a lesser mouth, and that the beautiful things belong only to the beautiful by your measure people. And it's all the same mistake, my lord. You looked at the outside of me, the fat harbor baker, and were certain the inside couldn't hold anything fine. And you were wrong, about the tongue, and about all of it. The worth was never in the shape of the vessel. It never is." The king was silent a long time. "I have spent my life," he said at last, "measuring worth by the outside, by the form, the breeding, the grace, and I scorned your body the first moment I saw it. By that measure, and then your inside answered me in my own founding tongue, and shamed every certainty I had. I have been blind, in exactly the way you say. I looked at the vessel, and never once thought to ask what it held." His voice roughened. "The most fluent keeper of my 1,000-year tongue, in all my kingdom, is a woman I dismissed with a glance for the shape of her body. What else have I dismissed with a glance? How much of what is finest in my kingdom have I scorned for its shape and never heard speak?" Chapter 6. The almost came on a clear evening, after the king had begun clumsily, against the grain of a lifetime, to unlearn the measure of the outside. He had set Iona to teaching the old tongue as the harbor quarter spoke it, living and warm, to scholars who had only ever held it cold in books. He had begun, haltingly, to listen to the common mouths his breeding had taught him to dismiss. He had begun to look at the woman he'd insulted and see, where he'd once seen only a body to scorn, the most remarkable person in his court. He found her in the scholars' hall at dusk, and he said, in the old high tongue, "Stay. My lord, you've made me a keeper of the tongue. There's nowhere I'd rather be than teaching it warm again. That is not what I mean, and you know it." He turned and spoke on in the old tongue, because it was the language of his founding oaths, and this was an oath. "I would make you my queen, Iona. Not despite the body I was fool enough to scorn, I'll not insult you by pretending I look past it, for there is nothing in you to look past. For the woman who answered my cruelty in my own founding tongue and shamed 1,000 years of my pride, who took up her honest space in my cold court and would not shrink, and would not apologize, and outspoke my whole lettered line in the language I thought my breeding owned." His hand rose toward her, not quite touching. "You showed me that I have measured worth by the outside my whole blind life. Marry me. Teach me to listen." The yes rose in her, and behind it, the old hard arithmetic she had carried her whole full-figured life. A wolfless harbor baker. A chubby common woman. A king whose court worships lean grace and fine breeding above all things. The moment you set foot in that hall as queen, you're the fat baker raised above every elegant highborn lady in the realm, and they will never let it go. They'll mock your body in the old tongue and the new. They'll call you the king's gluttonous folly. They'll use your figure as the proof that the high wolf went mad and shamed his line. You answered his insult once. That doesn't make you safe. It makes you the body the whole proud court most needs to scorn back into its place. "I can't," she said, but she said it in the common tongue, and gently, because she'd already half decided. "Theron, my lord, don't you see what I'd be to your court? The fat harbor baker on the throne of a kingdom that worships lean grace. They'll never bear it. They'll mock my body in every tongue they have, and call me your gluttonous folly, and use the shape of me to prove the high wolf shamed his 1,000-year line for a common vessel. I'd be the insult they never stop making, and they'd make it at you, through me." She drew a breath. "I've borne their glances my whole life, my lord, and I've never once shrunk for them. But a queen can't hide in a kitchen. As queen, I'd be the target of every cruelty your court has. Every day, forever, let me stay a keeper of the tongue, where the work is what matters and not the shape of the woman doing it. It's safer," he did not argue. That was the worst of it. For 3 days. Chapter 7. On the 3rd day, the court moved to scorn the harbor baker back into her place, and it came, fittingly, wielding the old tongue like a blade. It was the Lady Verena, the most elegant, lettered, perfectly bred noblewoman in Thessaly, the very pattern of the lean high grace the kingdom prized, and the most humiliated by a harbor baker outspeaking the court in its own treasure. And Verena, whose whole worth rested on the breeding and the form the court worshipped, had gathered the elegant nobles behind her and come to set the world right. She came into the scholars' hall with 2 lettered lords and a flawless cold smile. And she found Iona there among the old texts. "Your Majesty," Verena said in the old high tongue, pointedly, to make her cruelty a thing of breeding, and then, with elegant contempt, switching to the common tongue so the whole hall would understand the insult. "I come in love of Thessaly, which your fathers built on the purity of the line, the breeding, the grace, the old tongue that marks the high born as a thing apart. It is the foundation of your throne." Her flawless gaze raked Iona's full figure with practiced disdain. "And you would set upon that throne this. A harbor baker. A common, wolfless, gluttonous vessel, whose only claim is that she memorized some lullabies in a tongue she has no breeding to truly possess. Majesty, I say this in love of your line. We are all amazed the creature can parrot the old verses. A clever trick. But to wed her to make a fat common baker queen of Thessaly, the mother of your 1,000-year line," she shook her elegant head. "It shames the blood. It makes the kingdom a jest. The whole realm will say the high wolf, in some madness, passed over the finest grace of his court for a glutton from the wharf. Send her back to her oven with a reward for the novelty. Take a queen of fit breeding and fit form. And do not, Majesty, debase your sacred line with a body the whole court will scorn." She turned her cold smile on Iona and delivered the blade in the old high tongue, certain it would wound deepest there. Go back to your loaves, fat girl, before you shame him further. The old tongue in a glutton's mouth is a jewel set in mud. And the elegant court tittered, the cultured laugh of the proud sharing a cruelty. But Iona did not flinch, and she did not shrink, and she rose from among the old texts full-figured, unbowed, her grandmother's steadiness in her spine, and she answered the Lady Verena, in the old high tongue, fluent and clear and devastating, before the whole proud court. "A jewel set in mud, my lady," she said, and her voice carried, calm and warm and merciless. "You mistake which of us is the jewel and which the mud. You have the old tongue from a tutor, paid to drill it into a breeding that holds it cold. I have it from my grandmother, who had it from hers, sung warm over a poor child's cradle for 1,000 years, kept alive in the harbor quarter by women you would not look at, while your fine court kept it dead in books. You did not keep this treasure, my lady. We did. In our kitchens, in our lullabies, in the fat warm mouths of poor grandmothers you'd call gluttons. The jewel was never your breeding. The jewel was the love that kept the tongue alive when your cold line would have let it die in a library. She let it land, then switched to the common tongue, so that every servant and every lord in the hall would understand the rest, because the rest was not only for the lettered. You call me a glutton, my lady, and a vessel ruined by its own craft, and you've come to scorn my body back into its place. So let me say the thing plainly. In the tongue the whole hall can hear, since it's a thing the whole hall needs to hear and not just the lettered few." She faced the elegant court full on. "You have all measured me, my whole life, by the shape of my body. The harbor quarter and the high court, both you look at a full-figured woman and you read it as a failing, a vice, a lack, a thing to be scorned and shamed and told to shrink. And I will tell you, every one of you, what my grandmother told me, because there are girls in your kitchens and your harbor quarter and your great houses being shamed for their bodies this very day, and they should hear a queen say it." Her voice rose, warm and unshakable. "A body is not a measure of worth. A full body is not a failing. A woman who takes up honest space has committed no crime, and a woman who is fed and warm and round is not a lesser woman than one who is lean. She is only a different shape of the same worth. You looked at my body, and were certain it could hold nothing fine, and I answered your king in his own founding tongue, and proved you blind. The worth was never in the shape of the vessel. It never is, and every soul in this kingdom who has been told to shrink themselves, to shame themselves, to believe their body is a failing to be apologized for, I say to you, as plainly as I can, stop apologizing. You are not less for being more of yourself. Let the lean be lean, and the full be full, and stand on your own two legs, whatever shape they are, and let no proud court tell you your worth is written on the outside of you. Because it is not. It never was. It is written in what you carry and I carry, 1,000 years of a tongue these fine people let die, kept warm by fat poor grandmothers in kitchens you'd be ashamed to enter." She turned to the king, and the brave, reckless thing tore loose. "You asked me to be your queen," she said, "and I said no, because I was afraid your court would scorn my body forever and make me the insult they aimed at you. And here is the Lady Verena, exactly as I feared, come to scorn me back to my oven in the old tongue and the new." Her eyes were bright, but she did not weep, so I was wrong. Not about what they'd say, about whether I'd let it shrink me. I have never shrunk for them, my lord, and I'll not start now to spare myself a throne. You don't measure a queen by the shape of her body any more than you measure a tongue by the breeding of the mouth that holds it. So yes, if you'll have the fat harbor baker for a queen, in front of the elegant court that wants her gone, yes. And not to hide my body in a kitchen where it can't offend them, to sit it on a throne where every shamed girl in your kingdom can see it, and know that a body like mine can hold a crown, and that the worth was never, ever in the shape of it." The king crossed the scholars' hall and took her hand, before the elegant court, and when he spoke it was in both tongues at once, the founding language of his line, and the common tongue of the harbor quarter, because he had learned, at last, that the treasure belonged to both. "You'll not send her back to her oven, Verena," he said, "and you'll not scorn her body in my hall, in any tongue, ever again." She answered me in the founding tongue of my 1,000-year line more truly than my whole lettered court, because the treasure I thought my breeding owned was kept alive by the very common mouths I was raised to scorn. I have measured worth by the outside my whole blind life, Verena, and the most fluent keeper of my sacred tongue is a woman I dismissed with a glance for the shape of her body. The shame was never hers, it was mine, and the court's, and 1,000 years of measuring the vessel and never once listening to what it held. He looked at his elegant court. From this day, the old tongue is no longer the private treasure of the breeding. It belongs to every mouth that kept it alive, to the harbor grandmothers and the fat poor bakers who loved it when your fine line let it die in books, and the woman who proved it will be my queen, not despite her body, which there is nothing in to look past, but because she is the finest soul in my kingdom, and I was a fool to measure her by her shape. His hand tightened on Iona's. Take your blade back, Verena. A jewel set in mud, you called her. You were right that there's a jewel and there's mud in this hall. You only mistook which of you was which. And the Lady Verena, her flawless smile gone, looking at the full-figured harbor baker the king held by the hand the woman who had outspoken her in the old tongue and out-truthed her in the new-found that all her breeding and all her grace had nothing left to answer with. Because a court that worships the outside cannot, in the end, argue against a woman who has just proven, in 2 tongues, that the worth was always within. Epilogue 1 year later. The high kingdom of Thessaly spoke its old tongue differently now, not as the cold private treasure of the lettered few, but as a living warm thing, taught by the queen as the harbor quarter had always spoken it, in lullabies and market songs and the mouths of poor grandmothers who had kept it alive for 1,000 years while the proud court let it gather dust in books. For the measure of worth had changed in that proud kingdom, the creed that read worth on the outside. In the lean grace and the fine breeding and the elegant form, had been cracked open by a chubby harbor baker who answered an insult in the founding tongue, and proved that the finest things live in the mouths and bodies the proud despise. The worth is never in the shape of the vessel, it was said now in Thessaly, in both tongues. And the girls of the kingdom, the full and the lean, the high and the common, grew up hearing a queen say it, that had scandalized the court most a wolfless, full-figured harbor baker raised to queen, who still took up her honest space without apology, who had made the living of the old tongue and the truth that a body is no measure of worth into pillars of the rain. They had stopped, eventually, scorning her figure. They had not settled on what came after. The queen who answered back. The people said the common folk, and most of all the girls who had been told their whole lives to shrink, who now had a queen built like them on the throne of Thessaly and Iona, thought that would do very well. The lettered nobles had learned, humbled, to seek out the harbor grandmothers and the poor mouths that held the old tongue warm, because the queen had shown them that breeding had only ever kept the treasure cold, and love had kept it alive. Lady Verena, her grace humbled, had become, having tried to scorn the truth back into the kitchen, a quiet student of the living tongue, because she above any had learned what measuring the vessel cost. Theron came to the scholars' hall on a clear evening to the hall, where the second half of it had begun, because some things are worth keeping the shape of. He found Iona there, teaching a circle of children the old founding poems in the cadence of harbor lullabies, the way her grandmother had sung them, the way they had stayed alive. In his hand the king carried something small, a loaf of her bread, the first he had ever tasted, or one baked just like it, kept warm. I brought this, he said, setting the warm loaf in her hands, because everyone in Thessaly believed the most precious thing in my kingdom was the line, the breeding, the grace, the old tongue that marked the high-born as a thing apart. And so I looked at a baker and saw a body to scorn, and insulted you in the tongue I thought my blood owned. He folded her hands around the warm bread, and you answered me fluently, and I froze, because everything I believed about who possesses what was wrong. The treasure of my 1,000-year line was never kept by my breeding. It was kept warm in harbor kitchens by fat poor grandmothers I was raised to despise, kept alive, while my court kept it dead. The most precious thing in my kingdom was never the line, Iona. It was the love that keeps a beautiful thing alive in the mouths the proud refuse to listen to. His mouth found her hair. I scorned the vessel and never thought to ask what it held, and it held my whole kingdom's heart, 1,000 years of my own tongue, kept warm by the very people I was too blind and too proud to hear. Iona laughed the easy whole warm sound that had never once apologized for itself, and broke the warm loaf and shared it, there in the hall, with the children learning the old songs, kept like every beautiful thing the poor and the full and the overlooked have ever kept warm, while the proud let it grow cold. The old tongue of Thessaly lived now in every mouth that loved it, high and low, lean and full, and the children sang the founding poems as lullabies the way the harbor grandmothers always had. And the full-figured wolfless baker who had answered a king's insult in his own forgotten tongue, and refused ever to shrink the honest space she took, sat among the children, teaching them the warm living words a queen, built like the girls who'd been told all their lives to be less, proving with her every unshrinking breath that the worth was never, ever in the shape of the vessel. It was the only thing her grandmother had ever needed her to know, that she was not less for being more of herself, that a body is no measure of a soul, that the treasure lives in the warm, full overlooked mouths the proud refused to hear, and it had, in the end, answered a king, humbled a court, kept a 1,000-year tongue alive, and been worth a crown.